The Nancy Drew Files, Case Number 1, Secrets Can Kill by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 15. For a second, Daryl didn't move, and Nancy wondered if he'd even heard her. "Daryl?" she whispered again. Finally, slowly, Daryl pulled away from her and sat back. In the faint light, Nancy could see a look of surprise on his face, but fear was mixed with that surprise, and she knew that nothing was ever going to be the same between them again. "Well," Daryl said. "Good work, detective. How'd you do it?" "I was lucky," Nancy admitted. "A piece of evidence was right in front of me, but I didn't see it for a while. It was on the tape." "The tape? Jake's tape?" Daryl asked sharply. "The one and only." "Wow, you never know, do you?" Daryl gave a low whistle. "So which one did it?" What an actor, Nancy thought. "It wasn't Hal or Connie," she told him. "It wasn't Walt Hogan either." That was a guess on Nancy's part. Daryl frowned. "But I thought you said you knew who killed Jake." "No, I didn't. I said I knew why he was killed. There's a big difference." Daryl shifted impatiently. "He was killed because he was blackmailing people, and one of them finally stood up to him. We already know that." "Yeah, that's true," Nancy agreed. "But it wasn't one of those three. They were all tucked in their beds when Jake took that fall." Nancy was still going on guesswork. For all she knew, Hal, Connie, and Walt could have formed a team and pushed Jake down the stairs on that count of 3, but she didn't believe it, not for a minute. "So," she went on, "don't you want me to tell you what I found?" "It's not exactly what I had in mind when we came out here," Daryl said, trying to joke. "But if you really want to talk instead of doing other things, then go ahead." "Okay, here's what I saw on the tape," Nancy said. "I call it the Daryl Gray Show." Calmly and quietly, she went on to describe exactly what she and Bess and George had seen after Daryl had left the house that afternoon. "Surprise doesn't even come close to the way I felt when that tape ended," she said. "Sick is more like it." Daryl didn't say anything, so Nancy kept talking. "But I was confused, too. I still didn't know what Jake had on you, so I decided to find out. I don't have to tell you where I went, do I? Out Route 110 to a U.S. defense plant, then back to Bedford to a private estate where Russian diplomats hang out. Relax, study, a lot of top-secret plans from the defense plant, that stuff?" Nancy shook her head and laughed softly. "I just can't imagine how Jake felt when he realized what was going on. He must have thought he was sitting on a gold mine." She leaned forward slightly, and in the semi-darkness she saw the expression on Daryl's face. He looked resigned, like a trapped animal that knows it can't get free. But like that trapped animal, he also looked angry, ready to strike out at anyone who came close. For the first time since she'd left the dance with Daryl, Nancy felt she might be in danger. He was so close to her physically, and she found herself wishing the Porsche were a little more roomy. Some space would be nice just then. The length of a football field, for example. "You're almost finished," she told herself. "Just get it over with." "I know Jake told you that he'd found out your secret. I don't know how much of your salary you had to fork over to keep him quiet, but that doesn't matter," Nancy said. "It probably didn't even matter to Jake after a while, because Jake decided to go after the bigger fish, didn't he? Which of your contacts did he try to blackmail? The one at the defense plant? The one here in Bedford? Both?" Daryl turned his head to look at her, and Nancy saw that the anger was growing stronger. "Well, it doesn't matter," she said. "I'll find out." She spoke quickly, wanting to finish before Daryl exploded. "What I really want to know, and what I think you can tell me, is who killed Jake. Was it you?" The explosion came then. Nancy felt Daryl's hand, the touch of what had once made her quiver with excitement, close over her wrist in a painfully tight grip. Then he was getting out of the car, dragging her roughly after him. Nancy stumbled and felt her knees scrape the parking lot pavement, but Daryl had grabbed her arms by then and was pulling her up and pushing her against the car. "Listen," he whispered hoarsely. "Jake got in over his head, and so have you. If you think I'm a killer, what makes you think I'd stop with Jake Webb?" Nancy saw that look of desperate fury in Daryl's eyes and knew she needed help. Fortunately, she'd planned for it. As she stared back at Daryl, she saw his eyes blink suddenly as 3 sets of headlights were switched on in 3 different locations. The glare blinded both of them for a second, but Nancy heard car doors opening and knew that Bess and George were on their way. Most important, George's blind date, Ned Nickerson, was with them. Nancy was glad he'd come home for the weekend. Knowing he was there made her feel stronger. Daryl heard the doors too, and the sound of hurried footsteps on the pavement. He turned his head just in time to see 3 figures moving swiftly toward the Porsche. Then he ran. "Nan, are you all right?" Bess called out. "I'm fine," Nancy shouted back. She took off after Daryl, but before she'd even taken 2 steps, she felt someone rush past her. When she saw who it was, she stopped. Ned Nickerson could handle Daryl Gray any day of the week. Ned's strong legs easily ate up the distance between him and Daryl. As Nancy watched, he sprang into the air, landed on Daryl's back, and brought them both crashing to the ground. Then he was up, yanking Daryl to his feet. He half-dragged him back to the Porsche and slammed him up against its side. "Ned!" Nancy had never seen him act so rough. When he'd arrived earlier, she'd told him everything about Daryl, except for his feelings about her and vice versa. She was saving that for later, when the case was all cleared up. But seeing the tension in Ned's face, she wondered if he'd suspected something. She hoped not. She definitely couldn't handle it at the moment. But then Ned loosened his grip on Daryl's jacket and turned to Nancy with an apologetic smile. "Sorry," he said. "I tend to get carried away when some killer threatens my girlfriend." "Girlfriend?" Daryl exclaimed. Then he cried, "I'm not a killer." "You could have fooled me," Ned said quietly as he stepped away from Daryl and let Nancy take over. "You didn't kill Jake Webb?" Nancy asked. Daryl shook his head. "I just said that stuff to scare you off." His voice was drained of energy. He looked like a whipped puppy. "The guy at the defense plant, Mitch Dillon, killed Jake. He told me so." Daryl took a shaky breath and went on. "See, Jake wasn't satisfied with blackmailing just me, so he forced me to get him in touch with Mitch. Mitch played along with him, let Jake set up a meeting at the school, then he told Jake to give him the tape or he'd kill him." Daryl shook his head again, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "I don't have to tell you what happened then." "Knowing Jake, he probably laughed at the guy," Nancy said. "Yeah, and he died laughing, the stupid jerk." Daryl was calmer now. Then there was no anger in his voice, just sadness. "Anyway, when Mitch didn't get the tape, he was ready to explode. He told me to get it. Came on really strong with all kinds of threats." "It was you in the video lab that day, wasn't it?" Nancy asked. Daryl nodded. "I started to chase you," he explained, "but I just couldn't go through with it. I mean, what was I supposed to do when I caught you? Beat you up?" He smiled weakly and shrugged. "Waiting until you told me about the tape was one of the hardest times I've ever been through. But then when I watched it with you, I wasn't on it. I thought I could put this whole thing behind me." Finally, Nancy had the entire story. She should have felt like celebrating, but she didn't. She felt more like crying. From the looks on Bess and George's faces, she could tell they felt the same way. How could you celebrate when someone, even a creep like Jake Webb, had been murdered? When Daryl Gray's life was probably ruined? Nancy glanced at Ned. As usual, he sensed how she felt before she had to tell him. He came over and put his arm around her shoulders. Nancy smiled at him and then turned back to Daryl. "I don't think you'll ever be able to put it behind you," she told him. "Not completely, anyway. You'll have to face up to what you've done and do what the government will want you to do." Daryl didn't bother to answer. He just gave a defeated shrug, not meeting her eyes. "But I think I know a way for you to make it a whole lot easier on yourself," Nancy went on. Daryl raised his head, a spark of interest in his beautiful eyes. "How?" "By helping us catch the murderer." "You've got to be kidding. Mitch has nothing to lose at this point." Daryl's eyes swept over the parking lot, as if he were trying to find an escape route. But he was trapped, and he knew it. "Don't you understand?" he screamed. "He'll kill me."